Alrighty, happy Friday, I want to say weekend, because usually people would start their weekends on a Friday, unless, of course, you are scheduled to do some sort of a weekend work, like, for instance, migrating data from one database to another, performing maintenance. But it is Friday. Um, it is Friday. I'm trying to keep track of the dates. But welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show, where I focus on the topics that make SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery practical. And that encompasses not just the technology aspect, but also the people and the processes aspect. Because more often than not, it's not just the technology. It's not just SQL Server configuring always on availability groups, configuring the failover cluster and the quorum and all that. It's more than just that. By the time you release your availability groups in production, there are so many things that you have to consider. Part of that is doing operational support. And let me put in my banner real quick here. And the topic for this week's conversation is all about being in operational support. And whether you are a DBA taking care of SQL Server databases, or a sysadmin who's now being given the responsibility to take care of SQL Server databases, or even if you're a developer, and then all of a sudden you're the only one who knows how to take care of SQL Server, now you're given the responsibility to take care of it. Now, whether you're any of those, if you're responsible for SQL Server databases, you may have started in some form of an operational support role, whether you're a help desk technician or a technical support professional or application support. We have this path, this trajectory where you're starting out and trying to learn the ropes, and then when you became a SQL Server DBA, or when you were given the reins to take care of SQL Server databases, excuse me, what ended up happening was you gravitated towards operational support, mainly because that's what you have been doing for your previous jobs or for the past couple of years. And so it's one of those things where if you are managing, administering, supporting SQL Server databases, or taking care of SQL Server databases, most of the time you're doing operational support. And what's interesting is, because you're in operational support, you become so comfortable being in operational support. Sure, there are challenges, and it becomes exciting. Like, for instance, you're now moving databases from 2017, because now SQL Server 2017 is almost outside of mainstream support. So you now get the chance to support SQL Server 2019 after migration or after an upgrade project. But you don't get the chance to be a part of, like, working on projects. I have worked with several clients in the past, and I have had people do my SQL Server Always On Availability Groups training program. And these are people who have been SQL Server DBA, sysadmins for years. Somebody was even a DBA for 11 years. But all he did was operational support. He was never involved, or he was never included in any project-related activities, like, for instance, designing and implementing something like an always-on availability groups. In fact, one of his comments was, I have not had a chance in my entire career as a SQL Server DBA to deploy a failover cluster, even a Windows Server failover cluster, from start to finish. Because typically what happens is they would bring in a consultant, your company would bring in a managed services provider, or sometimes it was a former senior DBA who did it before you got there. He left, and now you're taking care of the support and operation of the infrastructure. So think about that for a second. You have been working for years, you have worked with always on available groups on an operational support capacity, but you've not had the opportunity to design, to even implement something from the ground up. And even in siloed organizations, like for instance, there's a DBA team taking care of the databases, there's a sysadmin team taking care of the infrastructure. And so the DBAs are only taking care of SQL Server. Somebody else is provisioning the server. Somebody else is racking and stacking those physical machines on in a data center. Of course, now everybody's moving to the cloud. Somebody is installing Windows, configuring Windows, building the failover cluster, making it resilient, highly available, reliable, and then handing it off to the DBA team. So the SQL Server DBAs are only responsible for the databases and or sometimes including the SQL Server instance. Everything else outside of that falls under the responsibility of somebody else. And so imagine working with a mission critical, highly available infrastructure like that, where you only get to work on the operational aspect, and then you end up doing stuff over and over and over. You see those issues over and over and over again. Then you feel like, oh, wait a second, I've seen this before. What's really frustrating for some people is that they get passed on to do more senior work because they have been so accustomed to doing operational support. And like I said, I see it a lot when people would say, when people would say, I don't have any experience building things from the ground up. They would say, I never had an opportunity to do that. And this is how being an operational DBA for so long is hurting your career. You're being passed on for opportunities for growth, even though it feels like challenging, but you're no longer growing. Like you're not learning anything new. Sure, the troubleshooting aspect, sure, the configuration aspect, there's a whole bunch of that. But it's like you're stuck in a certain level that you're not progressing. And that's the more, I want to say it's the more challenging thing. And how does that impact you managing an always on availability group or managing a high availability and a disaster recovery solution? For one, if your experience is of course limited, chances are your approach to solving a problem or troubleshooting an issue will also be limited because you're only exposed to operational support, right? And I want to share with you, of course, 3 things that you, as somebody who's in the operational support capacity, if you stay there for so long, that it will eventually hurt your career in the long run. Get your pen and paper ready. I'm looking for mine. Get your pen and paper ready. Start taking notes, because this is what will happen to you, or if it is not already happening to you, if you stay in operational support for so long and you have not had the opportunity to explore outside of that. The first thing is that you start to look at projects as tasks. You start to look at projects as tasks. Somebody reached out to me the other day and asked, hey, do you have a blog post that outlines, or even can you give me some Microsoft documentation on how to do a migration and an upgrade? Because the way he described it, it was an upgrade and migration. Do you have a blog post where or I could follow a step-by-step process on how to upgrade and migrate from a Windows Server 2008 R2, SQL Server 2008 R2 failover clustered instance, and move it into a SQL Server always on available group running SQL Server 2019 with Windows Server 2019? And that's because in operational support, you see this as something that, most people do it. A lot of people write blog posts about it. And so you start to look at it as a task and not as a project. When that happens, you focus on just getting it done and not thinking about the possibilities of other moving parts that are involved in this. There's a reason why stuff like this requires a project manager. I almost instinctively said project manager. It's one of the reasons why stuff like this requires a project manager, because it's not a task. Most operational support people, again, when they're part of operational support, they've not done this before. And that's why they're looking for guidance. A blog post, maybe a Microsoft documentation, maybe an article, or a YouTube video, maybe an online course. They're looking for guidance because they've not done it before. But it requires more than reading a blog post. I've seen this happen so many times with my clients where they would do it. Oh, I've read this. It's interesting. This takes me back to 2010. One of my clients read my blog post or an article. I wrote a 4-part series article on MS SQL tips on how to build a Windows Server failover cluster running SQL Server failover clustered instance. They followed everything from start to finish. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't working, reached out to me and said, we followed everything, yet it didn't work. Was my documentation incomplete? Absolutely, it is incomplete because it is not meant for you to use as a guide to work on a project. Every single one of the steps in a Microsoft documentation or a blog post or an article is just one piece of a huge project. But because you are so involved in operational support, you start to see that one piece as if it's the entire thing, right? It's just like you're so focused on, what was that quote? You're so focused on looking at the tree that you forgot there's an entire forest within it. And this is the danger of being in operational support for so long, that you start to look at projects as if they were tasks. It's hard, again, it's hard to work on something if you've never done it before. And so what we tend to do, in fact, you can go look at your Google search history. There's a ton of searches from your Google search history or your favorite search engine, if you want to refer to any of that. There's a ton of your Google search history that pertains to answering questions based on a task. I want to configure a file share witness for my failover cluster. I want to add a database to my availability group. I want to remove the database because it is causing failing over of the entire availability group. All of these things are part of you doing work, or I call them tasks. Like if you have a task list or a checklist, it's one item on your checklist, and then when you're done, you check it out, mark it as complete. But because you're so focused on the task that you tend to look at tasks, or even stuff like a project as huge as this, as if it was a simple task. No, it's just one piece of a bigger task. I remember, again, using a couple of examples from my work doing consulting. Customers would come to me and say, we want to do this. Do you have a reference article? I got a ton of reference articles. I got a ton of documentation. I got a ton of YouTube videos that I can show you. I got my own resources. But it requires more than that. Because for one, what are you trying to accomplish by doing that? So what's the overall goal for you migrating your SQL Server 2008 failover clustered instance onto SQL Server always on available groups in 2019? What is the goal? But if you are focused on a task, you're simply going to do it, but not realize maybe this was not the overall goal. Maybe this was not the original intent. Again, I've seen so many cases where customers and clients would come to me and say, this is what we want. And in fact, they're already looking at it as a project. And I would take a step back and look beyond what they really want and asking the question, What's your overall goal here? Why do you need this? Is it because it's how it was done in the past? Because in this example, it's a migration and upgrade project. You have the opportunity to start anew, meaning you can start from scratch. You can do side-by-side migration where you could do whatever you want, fix problems that you've encountered in the past. It's like starting all over again. You have that opportunity. But if you look at it as a task and not as a project, you end up just taking all that garbage, configuration settings, even old data or databases that you don't really need for high availability, but now you just move. Again, when you're in operational support for so long, you start to look at projects. You don't even realize how big of these are, how big of projects these are, and just treat them as tasks. Like, yeah, I got one task, migrate everything. No, it's not. It's a project, not a task. It took me a while to recognize that because when I was working as a data center engineer about, 15 years, 16 years ago, we have project managers, and the project managers are responsible for making sure that what we're trying to accomplish gets accomplished. Whatever goal that is gets accomplished. And I said, well, I'm just going to configure database mirroring. Nope. It's more than just configuring database mirroring. For me, it looks like a task, but it is just one item in a big project where everything else is involved. Because when you start to look at it, configuring database mirroring, of course, I'm talking about 16 years ago, configuring database mirroring would affect the application, would affect our disaster recovery strategy, because our database mirroring was an HA strategy, not a DR strategy. So it would affect our DR strategy. It would affect our escalation process. It would affect, and so everything will be affected, yet I was only looking at it as a task that needs to be done. Okay, I know I've spent so much time on this because this is a common mistake that I've seen so many times, that people will just look at it as task. It's a task. You know how it is when you have your DBA checklist throughout the day and you just mark them as completed at the end of the day, or as you complete every task. This is not just a task. Building a failover cluster and installing SQL Server and configuring always-on availability groups is not just a task. It's part of a bigger project. Okay, that's one. Number two is you become too focused on support-related tasks. This is a corollary to the previous one. Because you've been in operational support for so long, you have been so focused on support-related tasks, which means that you get bombarded with all of these requests. Like, for instance, a ticket would come in, and because you've done that ticket for so many times, there's this muscle memory that I'm not even going to think about it. This is exactly what I'm going to do. You become so accustomed to doing operational related tasks or support related tasks that every task, every request that would come in, you start to treat them as operational support. Again, this is a corollary to the previous point where, oh, it's just a request. It's just a request. And when you start getting accustomed to it, you no longer think, I think I mentioned that earlier, you no longer thinking about the forest because you're so fixated on one tree. Oh, we have an automatic, oh, not automatic, we have an unexpected failover. Let's fix that. Let's do root cause analysis. Let's dig deep. Well, you have been so focused on that you forget there's an entire infrastructure at work. There is an entire ecosystem at work when you're dealing with a high availability solution. So it's not just SQL Server, it's Windows. And of course, with SQL Server 2016 onwards, you have this database level health detection functionality where you're looking at what happened in my database. There's database level, there's instance level, There's service level, meaning the SQL Server service and Windows failover cluster. There's operating system level. There's hardware level. And all of these things factor into this. And then you end up spending so much time trying to figure out what was the root cause of the problem. You escalate stuff to Microsoft. They tried to figure out what was wrong. It's taking so long to resolve something. And then next thing you know, it's 4 months later and you're still trying to figure out what the root cause is. That now again, it's easy to see a ticket or a request as if it's an operational support thing and it's a support related task, rather than taking a step back and reevaluate. What is this request really all about? Okay. I'll give you a very simple example that I ended up mistakenly doing. One of the tasks that SQL Server DBAs would do is when somebody requests for a backup. Okay, when somebody requests for a backup, there's a request. You read it. Oh, take a backup. You take an existing database backup, just so you don't break the log sequence chain. Take that, or you do a copy only backup, so you can give them a copy of the database. And I've done that. Taken database backups from production, give it to developers, and not realizing I should have asked the person who requested this, who opened this ticket, what do you need the backup for? And this is what I mean when I said, because you've been in operational support for so long, oh, this guy is asking for a backup, I'll just give him a backup. I already have a backup. Oh, I don't want to break the log sequence chain. I'll take a copy only backup, or the previous backup, full backup that ran, I'll give it to him. And I fell into that trap, not asking, what do you need it for? For one, we have a policy in place about moving data around. We have a policy in place to protect and secure data. I call it the data caretaker. As a SQL Server DBA, you are a data caretaker. You are responsible for the care and feeding of the data. If somebody asks for a backup, you don't just give that person the backup without knowing what it is for, and whether or not that request would fall under your corporate security policies, your internal policies about how to manage and handle data, right? Because some people would assume, oh, somebody approved that, but at the end of the day, you're still going to be doing due diligence in order to provide that request. And so again, you have become too focused on support-related tasks that this has become your instinctive response when a user request comes in. Okay, so that's the second one. The third one. So let's take a step back and look at the first two. When you have been in operational support for so long, it definitely will hurt your career, which is why you need to take the next step, whatever that next step is for you. You start to look at projects as tasks. You treat them as tasks. The second one is you become too focused on support-related tasks, that every request would come in, you think it's operational support, and you just do it as the way you've done it in the past. The third one is, for me, the real deal breaker. The third one is you end up fixing symptom problems instead of dealing with the root cause. You end up fixing symptom problems instead of dealing with the root cause. I mentioned earlier about having or experiencing unexpected failover. When your availability group would fail over from your primary to your secondary replica, and you start doing an RCA, root cause analysis, what went wrong. You couldn't find any history, or you couldn't find any reason why it happened. Then you escalate to Microsoft. Took weeks, months, but then you couldn't find They also couldn't find any reason because they've looked at the SQL Server error log, they've looked at the always on help extended event session, and everything is not pointing to what the root cause is. And don't get me wrong, root cause analysis is great because you want to prevent that event or that incident from happening again in the first place. Couple of years later, you don't want that to resurface. Or if it did happen, you have documentation in place to deal with it. So that whether it's you or another person, they know exactly how to deal with it based on the documentation that you've done with your root cause analysis. The mistake that most people make, that most people in operations make, is they stick with just fixing the symptom. Oh, so many times that I have seen cases where we are getting this outage. We are experiencing these outages. I don't know, maybe because the file share witness is misconfigured. Oh, it's not being accessed. Oh, our network connectivity became unavailable, and so the cluster nodes could not talk to each other. Oh, the secondary replica all of a sudden became unavailable. SQL Server service crashed for I don't know what reason. And then all of a sudden, my failover, my availability group is not failover ready. And so we had an outage. And they're fixing that, not realizing it could be a design problem. And the reason why is because somebody else built the system, somebody else built the design, they implemented it, they designed and implemented it based on their availability of resources, their limited skill set and training, their limited experience. And so they built it that way because they've read it from a Microsoft documentation somewhere, or they've read it from a blog post somewhere. And that's why I said, when you start to treat projects as tasks and simply look for a documentation that would help you solve the task, you're not seeing the bigger picture. And so you end up, because you're not seeing the bigger picture, you end up solving symptom problems instead of really digging into the root cause and possibly redesigning everything. That is a very hard pill to swallow for most people, because for one, if you're the one who designed it, are you telling me my design is wrong? Number two, you're telling me that we have been supporting this thing for years and you're telling me it should not have been done this way. That's why it's a hard, and let's not even go into the VP who signed off on the design. Let's not even talk about the director of IT who approved the design. Okay, that's why it is a very hard pill to swallow for most people. But at the end of the day, if you're only fixing symptom problems, then whatever happens in the future, a variation of that symptom problem will translate into something. I'll give you a very simple example. Client of mine from 2015, I guess, built a Windows Server failover cluster, installed SQL Server, had a SQL Server always on available group stretched across 2 different data centers. They had a file share witness on a 3rd data center, and they were telling me, we keep getting, and they have not even had the success of moving into production go live because they have been trying to fix the problem for months. Yeah, we moved the file share witness to another data center. We still have the issue. We tweaked some of the cluster heartbeat settings. It's still, and again, focusing on symptom problems, focusing on trying to fix issues as if they're operational support tasks or support related tasks, not realizing that there is a design issue. We went back to the drawing board and simply asked, why do you need something like this? Well, that's what our consultant told us. And this is the problem or the challenge when you don't know exactly what the high availability solution is for. If you're unaware of what it is for and you're simply supporting it, you're now responsible for taking care of someone else's mistake that you're now taking up as your own. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people get so frustrated at the fact So they want to fix the problem, but I have to support it. And then they get so frustrated, they get so burnt out to a point where, again, we're fixing this issue again, to a point where they become apathetic of what they're doing because they feel like, oh, I'm not going to make any progress. I've escalated this to my manager. It's not going to make any progress because they have, and again, they don't, even their managers don't listen to them because they've been in operational support. They have no experience whatsoever dealing with design and implementation. And so their credibility is getting questioned. And it's that challenge of staying in operational support for so long. Again, whether you are a SQL Server DBA or sysadmin or even a developer, if you stay in operational support for so long, you are hurting your career. And the way I look at it is this. We've all been to school, preschool, grade school, middle school, high school, university. You don't want to be in high school for 10 years. Yet so many people get so stuck in staying in operation support because it's comfortable. I know exactly what I want. This is my comfort zone. And when problems like, again, failover cluster not triggering automatic failover for some reason, they know how to fix it, right? They know how to fix it. Oh, we'll bring the cluster online. They know how to fix it, but then it stops there. But they've not built a failover cluster from the ground up. They have not configured always on available group from the ground up. They have not designed it according to what the company really needs. And so they're not even comfortable being a part of a conversation when it comes to design and architecture. And that's the challenge when you stay in operational support for so long. And again, I've highlighted there's really there's really a lot more reasons, but I see these three as the common reason why being in operational support is hurting someone's career. Like I said, I've met people who have more experience, who have more background, highly skilled, yet they have not been a part of an implementation or design project, mainly because, again, they've been stuck in operational support for so long, they're afraid of taking the next step and becoming the lead engineer for a new project or a new implementation. Some people would say, well, we don't have enough availability groups, or if we only have one, so there's no point, right? But the question is this. How long are you willing to stay in operational support for you to realize that it's starting to hurt your career? And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want. But what I know is that we all want growth. We all want progress. Like I said, I've seen people who have been, in their line of work for like decades, and they have not progressed, and they're dying. I'm not going to burst into a song about dying inside, but they're literally dying inside because they feel like, with all of these new technologies, I don't feel like I'm growing, and and I'm afraid to explore more, right? Because you're in your comfort zone. It's about time for you to step out of your comfort zone and start exploring these opportunities, right? And this is exactly what my SQL Server Always On Available Groups training program is all about. It's also one of the reasons why whenever a customer would come in and ask for my help, I would ask questions about where their DBAs, where their staff is at, experience-wise, background-wise, training-wise, skill set-wise, because it is going to jeopardize the availability of the databases if they're not ready to support it. Even if they've been in operation support, but they have not done anything like this, it will jeopardize the operational integrity of the availability groups or any type of high availability solution. So if you do need help with looking at whether your team is ready for for something as huge of a responsibility as managing always on availability groups. And we're not just talking about one server here, we're talking about lots of servers, especially when you have multiple availability groups. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have a talk, let's have a chat. And in those strategy sessions, I call them strategy sessions for two reasons. One, we will get you closer, or not closer, but we'll get you really clear on what your goals are. Sure, you may have in mind that you want to migrate your existing infrastructure, or you might want to fix some of the issues in your existing availability, but that's possibly not the real reason why. We'll get crystal clear on the real goal. Not the technical goal, but the real goal. That's the first one, because it doesn't matter if you spend so much time, so much resources and energy trying to do a task when that task is not going to contribute towards the real goal. So we're going to get clear on that. And the second thing is we're going to get you to, part of that is we're going to put our heads together and come up with a step-by-step strategy on how to get you to your goal. Like I said, doesn't matter what you do. Even if you deploy a Windows Server 2019 with SQL Server 2019 and then build an availability group, if that's not the overall goal, you're just wasting your time. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session. Let's talk. And I am happy to provide guidance in any possible way. If I can help you achieve your goal, I'll be more than willing to do that. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would best serve your and your company's needs. Again, use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session and let's have a chat. All right. Join me again next week, although next week is going to be a little bit different the way I look at it. It's Canada Day next Friday, so I'm guessing it's going to be a little bit different. Join me again next week for another topic of conversation in our Practical SQL Server HA show. Enjoy your Friday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Yes, hopefully you're not going to be working really, really hard and exhausted throughout the weekend. Enjoy it. I'll see you again next time.